Hey y'all, we're starting today on a new series and it's called Out on Mission. Some of this is going to be a review, but what I found is every time I review, every time I go over what I've already learned, I realize, oh, I need to implement this. I need to add that. I didn't see this in quite the same way. I need a refresher, and especially I need to share this with somebody else. Because when you go through the training, so much comes at you. And even when you train others, there's just always this going back over it and going back over it. I heard Tiger Woods one time say that he spends almost all of his time just going over the most basic things, basic fundamental principles of golfing, swinging, putting. That's where he devotes his time. And I think that would probably behoove us as disciple makers to do that as well. So I'm going to talk about in this series being out on mission, but today I just want to start with just the fundamental idea that we are missionaries to our city, and that part of what happens to some of us who've come out of a traditional church model, which is most of us, not all of us, but most of us have come out of that, and many of us have come out of or have been in leadership for most of our adult lives in a legacy church, to come into this idea of disciples who make disciples, multiplying DMM, disciple making movements, that there are some fundamental shifts that have to happen in our thinking. And for me, part of it was instead of thinking like a pastor, I had to start thinking more like a missionary. And we got to make that shift. And the reason I'm using the term missionary, particularly today, is because of what that concept means to us. We understand some things about what a missionary is, whereas a pastor or a church leader doesn't always convey exact some of these things. And one of the things is the purpose that a missionary has. We think about what type of purpose a missionary has. I think most of us see when a missionary leaves their home and goes somewhere, there's great purpose in what they're doing, that they literally are on a mission, and it's usually a pretty clear mission. And another part of it is recognizing, again, missionaries are usually seen as outsiders wherever they are. They recognize that they're outsiders. And I think that's an important point. We're going to get back to that before we finish today. And then the other thing that I think is conveyed so strongly in the word missionary, at least it is with me, is the idea of sacrifice. And I can tell you that's not always conveyed when we consider traditional church, the idea of sacrifice. But sacrifice is a huge part of what we have to embrace, and how our thinking, our willingness to sacrifice has to be come to the forefront if we're going to be effective at disciple making. Now, if you are a catalytic leader, which we have agreed that on this coaching call, we are inviting catalytic leaders, that means you're leading other people. And so one question I have, and we'll have throughout this, is not, do you see yourself as a missionary? That's not the only concern. It's, are the people you lead, do they see themselves as missionaries? I remember one of the stories early on that I heard when I started learning about movements was a guy that went to another country. He got into a cab, and he's talking to the driver, and the driver introduces himself as a church planter. And this guy's driving a taxi, and he says, "Oh, but yeah, I'm a church planter." He drove a taxi maybe just to pick people up, to find people, to maybe to earn a living, but his identity was in being a church planter. And my hope is that the people I'm discipling and the people they're discipling is that we all see ourselves as missionaries to our communities, to our cities, to this area where we are. And we're on mission to make disciples. That's our mission. I was thinking about how this whole Christianity thing that we're involved in, it started as a mission with missionaries. Before we ever really had the development of the local church, we had people who lived on mission, and they were missionaries. And then and from that evolved the local church. But what's really been handed to us in our generation has mostly been church. And then we're having to work at getting on mission. And so it's kind of, we're having to go back to what originally the heart was of the people who followed Jesus. One thing that I found myself wanting to say pretty often to people that I talk to that are coming into disciple making movements and learning of these principles. Sometimes when I talk to people, I don't think they're getting exactly what it is. And so I wanted to say this: DMM isn't a different approach to church. That's not what this is. And it's not just doing house churches. And I meet people that they tell me they're doing movements. They're just doing house churches. They just took all their people and divided them into house churches. That's not what DMM is. It does involve simple churches, but that isn't the extent of it. But we're going out. Here's a big part of it. We're going out into lostness, and we're looking for the people that God's drawing, and we're making disciples who make disciples. But this whole thing starts with going out, not just meeting in a house. And so that, I think that's a really important point that I don't feel like all of us are mixed. I don't think any of us necessarily are kind of mixed up about that, but sometimes I meet people that are talking about movements and it's just really strong about, well, we meet in houses and that's just about it. Now, several years ago, before we even came into disciple making movement, the Lord challenged us here in our legacy church to do a missions trip to our city. We had at that point been doing missions trips every year to other nations, and I'm very much a proponent of that. But we were about to raise a bunch of money and send a bunch of people on a mission trip. And in praying about what we were doing, the Lord spoke to us and he said, instead of doing that, instead make all your efforts. This summer, I want you to do a mission trip to your city. And so that started with, instead of inviting people into our building, into our church, we're going to go out to people. And just that summer and what happened started a huge transformation of our church, our ministry, that eventually brought us into DMM. And there were a few shifts that we made pretty quick. And one of them was that we realized early on, when we started adopting this mentality that we are here in this city where I was born and raised, but now I'm here as a missionary. There are some differences in the way I think about that as opposed to being a pastor here. And one of the first things was this: I realized that I had to give up things that I loved and enjoyed. And our church had to give up things that we as a church loved and enjoyed so that we could devote ourselves more fully to the mission, because that's what missionaries do. There is sacrifice, and part of what we sacrifice is, it doesn't just mean we're stepping away from evil things. It means there are good things that we actually enjoy, but we don't have time for those things necessarily when we're a missionary. Just like a missionary that leaves their home and goes to another land, they leave the food maybe that they grew up with. They leave, the ability to go to their high school reunion easily. I mean, there's a lot of things that you sacrifice for the sake of the mission. That's a huge part of what's involved in us being on mission with him, is sacrifice. So part of that was that we shut down most of what we were doing to minister to the saved, to the Christ followers, to the saved people. We shut down a whole lot of those ministries in order to make time to go out to the lost. And that is something we have to do. Even if you haven't transitioned fully to be a relaunch, or you're not going to do that, maybe you're running a hybrid, if you're still pastoring, or whatever you find yourself doing, you're going to have to make time and that has to be a huge priority, because it takes a lot of time to go out among the lost, especially when you start doing the follow-up and all of those things. A lot of stuff happens. Another thing is that we had to renew our commitment to building the kingdom and not our church. Brent talks about this a lot, about, are we building a castle in the kingdom? And if we're honest, a lot of times our activity looks like we're putting a lot of energy into building a castle in the kingdom as opposed to building the kingdom. So that means that when we went out from our church at that point, we did not go out in the name of our church. We went out in the name of Jesus. I was with Bob Neiman recently on outreach, and whenever we would knock on the door, someone would open the door and Bob would lead with, "We are followers of Jesus." We never mentioned the name of a church. We never mentioned anything to do with DMM or anything. We were there in the name of Jesus. We're here as followers of Jesus. And I really loved that. I thought that was that just really centered on what we were doing. We're here to represent Jesus. And that's what a missionary does. They go in the name of Jesus. And you go somewhere and nobody knows the name of your missions organization or your church. When you go into another nation, it's Jesus that you're representing. Another part of it is we began to work with people who were willing to work with us, not just our own church people. We had to be willing to move beyond what we as a family, as a body, what we had to start being willing to work more with more kingdom-minded people. If you find someone who's kingdom-minded, start working with them. Another part of it, these are just some things immediately in the very first stages of this missionary mindset, is we had to learn to talk to unchurched people in ways that they can understand. That was a real biggie, and we still face that now. Learning to talk to unchurched people in ways that they can understand. And then another thing that happened really quickly is we got used to smelling weed. And that was long before any states had legalized marijuana. But so we're going in places and just realizing when you go out into darkness, you're going to face a lot of things. Someone shared with me recently, they had a team of people come from another state, and they were going out, they were doing a push week, and they were going out, and the people that had come in from the other state where marijuana wasn't legal, they were saying, wow, there's a lot of skunks around here, a lot of skunks. And I can say, whenever we go on outreach here, we smell a lot of skunks, and it's not skunks, it's weed. So I'm just saying there's just a lot of things you have to adjust to when you are going out on God's mission, things that maybe you're not used to. There's a lot of challenges. Now, y'all are familiar with the strategy of Jesus. One place he goes through it's Matthew 10, another place Luke 10. And one of the themes that we see in both of those passages is that he tells us to go as sheep among wolves. And I've learned a lot about what that means, that we go as sheep among wolves. And to me, that's something that I keep being reminded of and have to remind myself, and particularly the people that I'm bringing along with me, our team, people we're discipling that are looking to make disciples, is that we are going out as sheep among wolves. And that means that we look on purpose for places where we'll face danger and threat, places where we'll be uncomfortable. And many times, I'm just acquainted with missionaries that I know. We have some missionaries that we have sent from our fellowship here, from our church. They have looked for places to go where there is a threat, there is danger, they are uncomfortable. That's part of a missionary's life. And we take that for granted, that if you go into some places, there's some areas that have limited access. There's some areas where there are other religions that are predominant religions. There are certainly places where it's illegal to proselytize. It's illegal to invite anybody into a church or to read the Bible with them. We understand there's some danger there, but it isn't just when we're in those places that we should be willing to face danger. You should be willing to face danger in your own community, in your own city, and to actually seek out those places, because that's what we're called to do as we're living on his mission, is to be like sheep among wolves. When I remember going to a number of church growth conferences, and one of the thoughts early on that I heard was, well, when you are pastoring a church, you're predominantly going to reach people who are like you. So you need to look for people that are similar to you and, fit your profile, so to speak, and you go and look for them. But in reality, Jesus told us to do the opposite. He told us to go like sheep among wolves. Don't go as sheep looking for just, other sheep. Sheep do not go looking for wolves. That is not the habit of, a sheep. That's not a smart sheep. And so for us, it's different than just going where people are like us. It involves, on purpose, when we're on mission, looking around and saying, who here maybe isn't like us? And maybe that's where I should be focusing my activity. That's where I should go. Because part of what a missionary does is they have a target. They have a place they're going. They have people they're identifying that they want to reach. And this is a clue to us about who those people may be. We're going out into the darkness because that's where the light's needed. One of the things I've heard a lot of people suggest to me, of course, we've heard of the idea of Pipsy. You know that you're familiar with that, looking for Pipsy neighborhoods. One way I've done that is following the news where the high crime areas are. And if there's an area where there's been a lot of shootings, we on purpose start spending extra time in those places. If there's been if there's like a big drug bust in an area, we go there. If there's been something that's happened that's traumatic in an area, we try to be there the next weekend. Where are things happening in your city where there seems to be danger? There seems to be unrest. Darkness is prevailing. That might be just where you belong. Just like when that explosion happened in Lebanon, in Beirut a couple of years ago, there was this truck that was loaded with something and it blew up, I think is how it was. There were a lot of people that went into that area from the outside, just like what we're seeing right now with Turkey and Syria since the big earthquake. There are missions groups that are sending people into that region on purpose because there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of impact, there's darkness there. In that same way, when things are going on in our city, that should be a highlight for us. What are we going to do? Well, how are we going to mobilize to get the light in there? How are we going to go in there? So those are some of the things. When you find those areas, go there and start talking to people, just talking to people. Prayer walk there. Part of prayer walking to me, though, is not just praying and walking. It's also talking to the people I come across. And, you know, that's a component of being out in proximity to the people, getting to know the neighborhood, prayer walking. And just want to remind us all that every prayer movement, now this may have, every movement in the world, now this may have changed, but the last time I heard this was still the case, that every movement on earth started among the poor, that movements start among the poor. And so if they're going to start among the poor, that's the first P in Pipsy, then we have to engage the poor. And the final thing I'm going to say about Sheep Among Wolves is our son Grayson works in our jail, local jail here, and the way that they do it in different ways in different jails. Our jail here, they bring you in and you go into a pod and they'll lock you into the pod with the prisoners. So you go in and you're just fully there with them in that pod, locked in with them for a period of time. One night he was gone in, it was just him and he's by himself, and they lock him into a pod, but something happened in another pod. So all the guards and the people, their attention was on this other pod and trying to secure it and get everything straightened out. And they forgot that Grayson had been locked in the pod, and they left him in there for several hours. And so he had all this extra time. Normally they would only leave him in there maybe 45 minutes. He was in there for hours, and he was able to really, have a really good impact. But when he got home and he starts thinking about what happened, he was literally a sheep among wolves in the middle of that. So, but he had a lot of boldness in the middle of it, but you got to be prepared that's just, God is with you. He said he wouldn't leave us. He would go with us, but we need him with us. And then the final thing I want to talk about today is this. It's important that, and we've talked about this before. I just want to remind us all of this. This is an easy thing to forget. Though you live in your city, you actually are likely an outsider to the community that you want to reach. I was born in Augusta, Georgia, and I've lived here almost my whole life, except for a short time when I was away at college. So I'm here. I know lots of neighborhoods. I know people. My family's been in business here for years. I have 4 brothers. They all live here. So I'm pretty connected in this community. But in reality, to the people that I'm called to reach, or the people that are living in the most darkness in my city, they would look at me as an outsider. And so when I go into that community, one of the things that would really be helpful to me as a missionary to those people would be to partner with an inside leader. Inside leader, and I know you've heard that term, but an inside leader is someone, it's someone who is in that target group or community that I'm looking to engage. It's someone that's already there. They're already part of it. They know the culture. They speak the language. They understand the attitudes, the customs. They know what's going on. They know who's who and how things work there. And the other thing that person has that I don't have is this: they are not as threatening in that community as I am as an outsider. When I come in as an outsider, I immediately put them on guard. But when the insider is there, they aren't. And if I'm with an insider, it makes me, I'm already got an okay from somebody who's like them. Partnering with an inside leader can help us avoid some really big mistakes that would really thwart our efforts in disciple making. We have an access ministry that we've been working on that's been pretty successful. And it started with us having some contact information for a number of families in our community, several hundred families. And so I assumed, because I've actually spent a lot of time in these communities on those streets, I've actually been there a lot. I know the streets, I know their neighborhoods. It isn't like I'm a novice. I actually have been there and talked to people, but I assumed that I knew this community. And so when we started out, our intro is we would say, we're with this group, and I'd name the organization, we're with this group, and we're here doing home visits. And I use that word, we're here doing home visits. We did that both as we knocked on people's doors and when we called them on the phone, we would say, we're here doing home visits. And whenever I would call someone and talk to them and use that term, no one ever wanted us to come. People were trying to get off the phone and no one would schedule us to come. And when we would knock on the door and we'd say, we're here to do, home visits as part of release time, blah, blah. And we're the home visit team. And we would go through the spiel. People didn't want to let us in and people didn't want to talk to us. And so it looked like, from what we were doing, my judgment would have been, this access ministry is ineffective. This is not a good access ministry. These people are not interested. That's what, the conclusion that I was drawing. But one day I was going over this with a lady that I know who's a friend of mine who grew up in this community. She grew up in one of the target areas we were visiting. She grew up there, went to school there, graduated there, and she still has friends and family that live in that area. And so I'm telling her what we're doing. And she said, well, tell me what you're saying. And so I told her, oh, okay, well, I just come, and I literally went through it with her. I got just my first line out, well, I'm Suzie, I'm with Release Time, and we're here doing home visits. And she said, whoa, just right when I said that, she stopped me. And she said, Suzie, do not say home visit. Don't say that. She said, that's what social services says whenever they call or they come out to your house because somebody's reported you're abusing your kids or you're not caring for your kids. They use the term home visit. And I'm like, what? And then I realized, well, maybe that's why that word sounded familiar. I don't know. We just pulled that word out, pulled that little phrase out of a hat. It seemed normal to me. We're going to the people's home and visiting them. She said, yeah, that is a trigger for them. When you say the words home visit, immediately they're on guard. They don't want you in their house. They feel like they're being targeted. You're there to check up on them. This is not a friendly term. And I know that it seemed to me kind of like, really, that's kind of silly. That's not what we're there for. But those two words, home visits, were causing issues. And so immediately we erased that. We're not using that, changed our approach. We quit doing that. And suddenly the same list of people that we're calling to do home visits, now we're calling them, and we have a different approach that Tammy suggested. And we're getting all these yeses, and we're getting all these doors that open, and people are inviting us in, and people are in fact making appointments with us and cleaning their house and putting out, snacks for us when we come. A very different reception, all because we were using the wrong words. And, we could have just written off all those families, all that information that we had, all the work we did to develop the partnership with that ministry that became an access ministry. We could have written all that off just because we were using the wrong language. But because there was an insider, someone who had insight into what was going on there and how these people think and what words mean to them, it changed everything. And so now, honestly, at first I thought, this is like magic. It is amazing. It is, all we did was change a couple of words, and it was all, and of course it's not magic, but it just almost seemed like magic because there was such a shift and a change in their receptivity. And it wasn't magic. It was just the wisdom of an insider. And if you're effective as a missionary, if you go somewhere, and I know at least one of you on this call is in a foreign nation as, as a worker there, someone that, in times past, we would have termed a missionary, you know the value of an insider there, someone who knows the ways of the place that you are, the language, the customs, and they can help you navigate that. It's really helpful. And I just encourage all of us, if you're looking at your city, even if you think oh, I got this, I'm from here, I know these people, I speak their language, recognize you might be an outsider as well. So today, as we start this series talking about being out on mission, we're talking about shifting our thinking, and not just our thinking, but the people that we lead, the people we coach, the people we train, inviting them into considering themselves to be missionaries in their city. And we just talked about the idea that what that really means is that we're going out as sheep among wolves, which is challenging to our American way of living, where we seek comfort above most things. And then we just talked about the value of working with inside leaders. But in the coming weeks, we're going to dig deeper into what all is involved in going out on mission and get into some more specific things. But I hope this was helpful to you. And yeah, that's all I got.